U hebt geluk, want vanavond hebt u de gelegenheid om een andere ongelijkheidspionier aan het werk te horen. Professor James Galbraith van de Universiteit van Texas in Austin. Die, zoals Branko Milanovic, voormalige onderzoekseconoom aan de Wereldbank, heeft geschreven, al ongelijkheid aan het bestuderen was en ervoor waarschuwde toen alle andere economen aan het slapen waren.
So here's the first proposition that I want to state as a point of departure or a foil. We'll call it the Piketty proposition. And that is that inequality under capitalism has an inherent long-run tendency to rise for the reason that the rate of return on capital, what he calls R, tends to exceed the rate of growth of the economy, what he calls G, R greater than G, and that leads to the accumulation of financial wealth in the hands of those who own capital over time. The second proposition, I think, will be extremely familiar to you as members of the European public. I call it the mainstream conventional view or conventional wisdom, which is that higher inequality, particularly inequality of wages in the United States compared to Europe, reflects the more flexible or more efficient Anglo-Saxon labor market, and therefore is associated with a lower rate of unemployment in general than has been the condition in Europe, where supposedly low rates of inequality, rigid labor markets, are associated with high unemployment. So the choice is the American model, free market capitalism, or jobs plus misery on one side, or the European model, which has socialistic, at least by American eyes, which is to say welfare plus unemployment. Right? A very nasty choice. What I'm going to argue for you tonight is that both of these propositions, the Piketty proposition and this mainstream view about labor markets, are false. That they're false as a matter of theory and as a matter of fact. Now, if you read Professor Piketty's book, all 671 pages of it in the English translation, and if you read it carefully, you will discover that there is one exception to the general rule of rising inequality as a result of R being greater than G. What is that exception? It's called the 20th century. It's a rather lengthy exception, beginning around 1914 and carrying on at least to the 1980s. And Professor Piketty tries to find excuses for the 20th century, in particular laying at least some emphasis on the proposition that a great deal of capital was destroyed in the two world wars. In fact, it's not actually true that a great deal of physical capital was destroyed in either world war. What happened in the 20th century was the construction all across the world, in the United States in the 1930s, and in Europe in the post-war period, as well as in Japan, all across the developed world, of established systems that stabilized the distribution of income, that provided for the effective taxation of high incomes, the progressive income tax, for the effective taxation of corporate profits, the corporate profits tax, and for the creation of stable sources of social insurance which stabilize the incomes of working people. That is to say, Social Security, public retirement, health care insurance, unemployment insurance, deposit insurance so that people didn't lose their money in the banking system, the whole sequence of 20th century institutions. Plus a certain amount of recycling of capitalist accumulation into consumption expenditures, which is particularly important where that is advantaged by tax measures, which is the case in the United States. And when you put all of those things together, what you find, and I do this sort of analysis, at least analytically, in a paper that's just been published in the World Economic Review, is that there's no necessary reason why the simple fact of the rate of return being higher than the growth rate will generate an increase in inequality. It could be stable, inequality can be declining. In the 20th century, it was not an anomaly, but rather a construction which has not even today entirely been unmade. Which means, if that's correct, that under the systems in which we live, inequality is not necessarily fated to rise, and we can be at liberty to think about the policies that will prevent it from doing so. That's my simple point on Piketty's proposition. The second proposition was that an unequal wage structure, flexibility in labor markets, was good for jobs, was good for employment. The theoretical cornerstone of that proposition is the theory of supply and demand. Allow wages to adjust so that skill levels are appropriately compensated and employers will give everybody a chance to work. The empirical bedrock of that proposition, that is to say the claim on which it rests, is this comparison between the United States and Europe that I described earlier. Yet, on the theoretical side, there are at least two pretty good counter propositions. Propositions which, at least in one case, are even pretty well acknowledged in mainstream economic theory. In the other case, very well acknowledged by historical experience. The first counter proposition is a model of search for jobs. And that model, associated with some economists named Harris and Todaro back in the 1970s, argues that if you have a lot of inequality, people quit the bad jobs to look for better ones. They quit the farms and go to the cities to line up at the factory gates looking for work. Right? You can see this very clearly, for example, in post-Francoist Spain. Unemployment goes up when people start having the liberty to move. You can see it very clearly in modern China. People leave the countryside and they take the train and they go to the towns looking for jobs because the pay is better. And the inequality sponsors migration. You can see this, of course, in the movement from East Europe to West Europe or from Poland to the UK. It's a universal phenomenon. And there should be no surprise that it's associated with a lot of unemployment because in an unequal society, there are fewer good jobs than there are bad ones. That's what being unequal actually means. So there's a second reason why, particularly in small economies, maintaining, this is relevant for Belgium obviously, maintaining a high and equal wage structure is good for international competitiveness. And cutting wages is precisely the wrong thing to do because it will damage your productivity growth in the long run. The notion that the United States is a high inequality country. I suspect everybody here believes that to be the case. The point I want to make to you is that if you have that idea, you probably acquired it sometime in the last 35 years. You didn't have it before that. Right? I grew up in a country that prided itself upon being a middle-class egalitarian product of the New Deal. Right? And of having brought precisely that virtue, for example, into the Second World War. And that perception continued to hold through the full employment years of the late 1960s. At that time, some of what we now call Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, and Greece, until 1974, was still fascist or under military dictatorships. This is not an egalitarian structure. Right? And much of it, much more of it, had been under that control relatively recently, which had not been true in the United States. So one has to ask whether the notion that the US is a high inequality country is something which is really reflected by history or something which is a marketing operation of the Reagan period and its successors. Well, inequality did rise in the United States, and it rose, as it did everywhere, in the pay structure. But what I want to show you next, which is the comparison of our numbers, which are basically based upon pay, to the other literature on inequality, is that the rise in inequality in the United States, as measured in incomes, is fundamentally a factor of the capital markets, not of the labor markets. I want to make an argument to you that I'm not going to develop in depth, but just suggest an analogy which comes out of a great deal of other work that I've done. And that's about what is the measures of inequality, these extremely messy measures. What do they resemble? I would argue that they are pretty closely analogous to the measurement of blood pressure in the human body. That is to say, there's a range. There's a range which is considered normal. And within that range, lower is generally more healthy. Right? Blood pressure can be too low. Then you get East Europe, you get sluggishness, you get a lack of dynamism. Zero inequality, zero blood pressure, that's for the morgue, that's for the cemetery. You're not going to find that in living economies or individuals. And then there is the proposition that when the measure goes up, inequality, like blood pressure, it may be asymptomatic. It may, in fact, feel fine, but it's a sign of trouble. It's a sign that there may be a crisis ahead. It's usually a sign of a crisis that's emerging from an out-of-control financial sector, of a credit boom which is going to lead to a bust, such as we experienced in 2007, 2009, and then onwards into the sovereign debt crisis of Europe, which is part and parcel of a global financial crisis. So it strikes me that that analogy is worth keeping in mind. Are there remedies? Yes. But I would argue that the remedies are specific rather than universal. And the idea you're going to come up with one great policy measure for the whole world is fanciful. In the US, I'm in favor of simple policies that have been proven to work. Raise the minimum wage. Raise it by a lot. We have a low minimum wage. Raise the damn thing. Can be done by regulation, and the whole economy responds. It's self-enforcing because people know how much they're paid. They can call the bailiff if they're not being paid what they're supposed to be paid. Shrink the banks. Prosecute the bankers. Part and parcel of what happened in the world credit system in the 2000s was one of the most massive waves of financial criminality in the history of the world. And I use that word in the precise technical sense. Crimes were committed. Crimes of financial misrepresentation and fraud, crimes of abuse of financial power. Those crimes are prosecutable under national law in the United States and in most other countries. They have been, in fact, prosecuted extensively on the civil front, but the criminal prosecution has not been there. It was there in the 1990s. There's experience doing it with prosecutors who know how to do it. It's not that complicated to find out when you've got a massively criminal enterprise to get people to testify to that effect. Put people in jail for that and you will get less of it in the future. Leave them out, and guess what lesson they draw? They draw that lesson that after a certain amount of time they can do it again. Right? And they draw the lesson correctly that the politicians are in their pockets. This is not conducive to fixing the problem. Expand the Social Security system. Just simply make it easier for people who have to leave the labor market because because private sector is not providing jobs to retire in comfort. Rich regions, the United States, Europe as a whole, rich countries can afford to do that. It is a massively stabilizing force in economic activity. It's very good for offsetting the derelictions of the other players in the economy. We were saved in the United States by the fact that the Social Security system still works. It's very important to remember this because cutting it, which is on a lot of agendas, is going to have a strictly destructive effect. Europe is, of course, a more complicated case because you've got countries and you have treaties and you have all kinds of constraints that we actually don't have or that we got rid of between the Civil War and the New Deal. Okay? In Europe, I would refer you simply to a little book that I have co-authored. I'm a minor co-author with the Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis and the English economist Stuart Holland, now at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, called The Modest Proposal, which outlines a series of policies that could be implemented to stabilize the European economy as a whole within the framework of the existing charters and treaties, within the framework of the Eurozone. That's why it's a modest proposal. But there are 4 elements to it. One is to use the European Central Bank to effectively stabilize the public debt burdens, the Maastricht-compliant portion of the public debt of the sovereign countries of Europe who wish to participate, thereby effectively restructuring that debt, but in a way which does not violate the charter restrictions on the mandates of the central bank. Secondly, resolve the bankrupt banks, starting with Greece, one by one, right? Put them in the hands of competent authorities rather than allowing them to be privatized back to local landholding oligarchs, recreating the previous political problems. Thirdly, launch a new round of investments under the auspices of the European Investment Bank, relaxing certain requirements which are not functional, but using the technical and financial capacity of the bank and the European Investment Fund to get economic activity going again. And fourthly, create at least some elements of a system of social solidarity that works across Europe. We suggest as a first measure that school lunches would be a very good idea. It is not a good idea for any child in Europe to have to go to school without breakfast or without lunch. Right? Feed them. You could do that at the European level and you would combat fascism in Greece by doing it. Very useful. My friend Laszlo Andor, the just former European Commissioner for Employment, has suggested mutualizing and having a common unemployment insurance fund. That's a very good idea. Right? I would go beyond that and have a European pension union, which would help to stabilize the incomes of the elderly. Instead of having them cut in the crisis countries, have them supported, but not in a way that requires you to operate through incapable or diminished, impaired, or untrustworthy national governments. Do all of those things and stabilize the European economy as a whole, and see if you can't stabilize the economies of the crisis states in the process. The basic principle here is, and you mentioned it in your introduction, the alternative to austerity is not stimulus, or it's not simply stimulus. It's not a temporary measure, and it's not an abrupt measure, and it's not a measure that promises miracles. The right alternative to austerity is solidarity. It is to stabilize and protect the most vulnerable populations and to use their stability and purchasing power as a way of stabilizing and ultimately revitalizing economic activity and social activity for all of us together.